Now, one of the key problems in trying to understand happiness, and indeed the science and psychology of happiness, is that it does indeed involve other similar things like joy and gratitude and meaning. And indeed, many scientists and psychologists have argued for many, many decades about what happiness really is. And while for most of us we think of happiness as something that only arrives through the acquisition of some goal or some thing external to us, and of course that is true, there is also something called synthetic happiness or synthesized happiness, which turns out to be at least as powerful and perhaps even more powerful. I'll just say right off the bat that I'm not going to tell you that all you have to do is sit in a chair and imagine being happy in order to feel happy. Most of you have probably heard about the general conditions for obtaining happiness, and they always seem to circle back to some of the same basic features of get great sleep, have great social connection, pursue meaning, don't focus to any overextent on things like pursuing money, because there are indeed these studies that show that the amount of money that people makes does not necessarily scale directly with happiness. There were times in which pursuing and being involved in work and pursuing degrees and finding meaning in my vocation actually separated me from the opportunity to have quite as many social connections, or quite as much sleep, or quite as much exercise, or even quite as much sunshine for that matter. So all of the things that we're told that we need in order to access happiness on a regular basis oftentimes contradict with the pressures and the requirements of not just daily life, but in building a life that allows us to have the kind of resources that we need in order to have things like quality social connection and the time and opportunity to get regular exercise and great nutrition, et cetera, et cetera. And what I won't tell you is that you need to abandon all goals in terms of pursuing money, career, et cetera, and simply focus on relationships. But we will talk about what constitutes an excellent social bond or even an excellent conversation. There's excellent research that points to the fact that even rather shallow connections, that is, connections between people that you happen to just see in the hallway on a regular basis, not even requiring close bonds of any kind, can be built into close bonds that can deliver a tremendous amount of feeling and genuine social connection, provided certain conditions are met. Now, before we begin today's episode, I'd like to talk about a very specific tool that applies, yes, to our pursuit of happiness, but actually to our pursuit of everything, including quality sleep and ongoing motivation, etc. I've talked many, many times before on this podcast and on other podcasts and on social media about the critical value of getting regular bright light, ideally sunlight in your eyes within the first hour of waking, or if the sun isn't out when you wake up in the morning, to turn on a lot of bright artificial lights and then get sunlight in your eyes for anywhere from 5 to 20 minutes, depending on how cloudy it is, in the early part of the day. Absolutely outsized effects on mood and focus during the day and quality of sleep at night. Now, there's another sort of central tenet of getting great sleep and improving mood and focus throughout the day, and that's to avoid bright artificial light exposure to your eyes between the hours of about 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. So a very simple yet powerful solution that's supported by peer-reviewed research in humans is to try and make your indoor working and or home environment during the day as bright as possible. Now, if you can achieve that through direct sunlight, terrific. If you can get outside a lot during the daytime, terrific. But many people simply cannot. But most people do have some windows in their environment. I realize some don't, but most people do. And as a consequence, most people are using rather dim artificial lighting indoors during the day, and then very bright artificial lighting indoors in the evening and at night. That's a problem. And if you think about it logically, you want to do the exact reverse. So it's been shown that if you simply increase the amount of bright artificial light that you are exposed to during the day, and remember, this is not an excuse to not get your morning sunlight viewing, but in addition to that, to make your indoor artificial lights very bright throughout the day, and then much dimmer from the hours of 6 p.m. until bedtime. Or if you can't do that, then maybe as soon as you get home from about 8 p.m. until bedtime, and then dim them way down between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. or off entirely. That's going to be a far better pattern for your sleep-wake cycles, focus, mood, etc., than what most people do, which is to have a few windows in their indoor working environment during the day and keep the indoor lights rather dim at a time when they need more photons, more light energy. And then in the evening when they get home, because it's dark outside, they tend to turn the lights much brighter. You actually want to do the reverse. And I once was at a meeting where I heard Carl say something to the extent of, we don't know what other people feel. In fact, most of the time, we don't even really know how we feel. And while that statement was meant to report several different things about the way that the brain works and emotions, etc., one of the things that he was emphasizing, and I know he was emphasizing it because he confirmed this for me, was the fact that language, things like the word happiness or joy or meaning or pleasure or delight, are actually not very precise when it comes to describing our brain and body states. So for instance, if I tell you I'm feeling pretty happy, I know what that means for me, at least in this moment, but you don't really know whether or not it means the same thing as what pretty happy means for you. If I say I'm extremely happy, and I have a big grin, I have a grin on my face that I can't seem to wipe off my face, well then you might get a sense of how much happier I am than pretty happy, but it's still hard to calibrate my level of internal state or happiness. And the same is true for you and for everybody else. And it's important for us to acknowledge this because at this point in human history, 2022, we don't really have a measurement like body temperature or heart rate variability, or even a way to measure neurochemicals in the brain and body that give us anything better than a crude correlate or an estimate at best of what happiness is. So that's really important to understand and to keep in mind throughout this episode. It doesn't mean that we cannot have a strong data-driven conversation about happiness and what brings us to a state of happiness, but it's very important to understand that language is not an ideal and maybe even a deficient tool in terms of describing our emotions and our states of mind and body.